This is the second lecture of Module 10 for Mrs. Ross' General Science class at the Lancaster Learning Link. Just a reminder, next Monday is parent-teacher conferences, and therefore after class you'll be leaving your binders with me, and I will do a binder check to make sure that you have everything organized the way it's supposed to be. And then I will return your binder to your parent when they come for their parent-teacher conference that day. So remember to go back to the handout that I gave you at the beginning of the year about binder organization and make sure that you have everything in there for modules 9 and 10 that you should have. So let's move on now to module 10 and finish up this module about classifying life. Last week we looked at this, or we started filling out this particular table that shows us the 5 different kingdoms that biologists use to classify life. Last week we talked about kingdom Monera that contains all the prokaryotic cells. And today we're going to look at kingdom Protista, fungi, plantae, and animalia. So let's begin our discussion of kingdom Protista by looking at how the organisms in this kingdom are like the organisms in kingdom Monera. Well, the main thing is that most organisms in both kingdoms are microscopic. In other words, they can only be seen under a microscope. But kingdom Protista is unlike kingdom Monera in that in kingdom Protista, the organisms are made of eukaryotic cells. Recall that in kingdom Monera, they're made of prokaryotic cells. Also, in kingdom Protista, the organisms are much bigger than those in kingdom Monera. For example, a single-celled organism in kingdom Protista is about 10 to 100 times larger than those in kingdom Monera. Now remember, kingdom Protista is further divided into 2 groups, protozoa and algae. Now, protozoa in the kingdom Protista are mostly single-celled organisms. In other words, each organism consists of one single cell. These single-cell creatures tend to behave like little animals. They move around and most of them eat other organisms. The other group of organisms in kingdom Protista is algae. Now, algae is more like plants, but algae do not have roots, stems, or leaves. Algae make their own food by photosynthesis just like plants do. But remember, they are not plants because they don't have the roots, stems, and leaves. What's amazing is that algae produces 75% of the Earth's oxygen. Remember, that's one of the outputs of photosynthesis. So while plants in kingdom Plantae produce a lot of oxygen from photosynthesis, the majority of the Earth's oxygen actually comes from algae producing it. Now, both of these groups, protozoa and algae, need moisture to live. And pretty much wherever we find water, fresh or salt water, there will probably be protozoa, algae, or both. So let's go back to our chart here and fill in some more information that we have now from kingdom Protista. I've outlined this with the red line in the box at the very bottom. You need to include here that protozoa move on their own. They have their means, sometimes little features that allow them to sort of swim around, but generally they move on their own. And just like some organisms in kingdom Monera are pathogenic, there are some organisms in kingdom Protista that are pathogenic, which means they cause disease. Also, you need to write down there that algae produce 75% of the Earth's oxygen. Finally, just like those creatures in kingdom Monera, the organisms in kingdom Protista need moisture in order to live. So that concludes our discussion of kingdom Protista. And let's move on to the next kingdom, kingdom fungi. Now, what's unique about this kingdom is that most of the organisms in this kingdom feed on dead organisms, and they are called decomposers, which are organisms that break down the dead remains of other organisms. These things are very, very important. As we've talked before, that most dead things decay. A lot of times that decay comes from these decomposers in kingdom fungi breaking them down. And then all of that decayed material returns to the soil as nutrients and fertilizer. So kingdom fungi is very important as it helps to decompose and break down the dead remains of other organisms. Now, one common example of a organism in kingdom fungi is that of a mushroom. Figure 10.6 in your book explained the general structure of a mushroom. What you need to know about this is the fact that the cap, gills, and stalk are the things that are above the ground, and that's what's used for reproduction. But really, the main part of this fungi, this fungus, is called the mycelium. And that is actually underground or underneath the surface of the dead material if the mushroom was growing on something besides the ground. The mycelium looks like a root system, but it is not a root system. Okay, you need to remember that. That is the main part of the fungus, that mycelium. Now, hopefully this last week you were keeping an eye on your two bags, one banana that just was a banana, and the other bag had the banana with the yeast in it. And what you should have seen was that yeast acting as a decomposer and breaking down the banana. Now, I understand that in the other bag without any yeast, the banana still probably got mushy and stuff, but you should have seen a difference showing you that the yeast was decomposing that banana as it did its work as part of kingdom fungi. Let's move on to the fourth kingdom, Kingdom Plantae. Now in this one, under this kingdom, we did experiment 10.3, where a few weeks ago I brought into you a piece of a plant from my house that I had cut off. I took that home, put it in some water, and then it went through the process of vegetative reproduction. And that is something that is unique to plants. It's the process by which one part of a plant can form new roots and develop into a complete plant. Now, this is very different from other kingdoms. For example, if you cut off my arm, I wouldn't just grow a new arm. But in Kingdom Plantae, when you cut off a part of it, because of vegetative reproduction, one part of the plant can form new roots and develop into a new plant. Now, here's a picture of that plant after several weeks of being in the water. And you can see there these little, kind of looking like little buds that have started. And those, if you continue to give this time and continue to keep it in water, those would continue to grow, and eventually if you planted that, they would become the new root system and the whole thing would start over. I know this works because this particular plant that I cut this off of, I've done that many times where I take a cutting, put it in water, see it develop new roots, I plant those, and I get a whole new plant going again. So it's kind of a nice feature for those of us who like plants, but it is one of the unique features of Kingdom Plantae. Now, let's review again the differences between algae, which is part of Kingdom Protista, and the other plants in Kingdom Plantae. Now, they are similar, algae and plants are similar because both produce their own food with photosynthesis. But plants are different from algae because plants have these specific parts like roots and stems and leaves, and those parts have specific tasks. Algae do not have those parts that have those specific tasks. So that's the difference between algae and Plantae, And that's one of the reasons that algae isn't considered in Kingdom Plantae, because it doesn't have roots, stems, and leaves. Now, last time we talked about the three different kinds of cells. There are animal cells, plant cells, and bacteria cells. Since we're talking about plants right now, let's look at how the cells of plants differ from the cells of animals. Well, the most notable difference is that plant cells tend to be more square or rectangular than animal cells, which tend to be more round and oval. Also, plant cells have cell walls. Now, that's in addition to the cell membrane that you see in both plant cells and animal cells. But these plant cells also have cell walls around them. Then, plant cells have another organelle called the central vacuole. That is what holds the water, and if there's not enough water, that central vacuole gets smaller, and if it's filled with water, it gets bigger. And we see the effects of that in the next experiment. In experiment 10.4, you learned about the central vacuole and turgor pressure. Turgor pressure is the pressure inside a plant cell due to the increasing size of a central vacuole. Kind of think of the central vacuole as sort of a balloon. And when that balloon or central vacuole gets filled with water, it expands. When it expands, it sort of holds open the cell wall so that it doesn't collapse. So turgor pressure this pressure results inside the plant cell when that central vacuole becomes very large and increases the pressure on the cell wall. So when you did experiment 10.4 last week, you should have found that initially you let the celery wilt. Now, you may have in the past thought that the celery was dead, which I guess it kind of is because we've cut it off of its source of food and everything. But what you really saw was that the celery was wilted because for a day or so you didn't give it any water, and so all the water that was in the central vacuoles was used up by the plant, and that decreased the turgor pressure because those central vacuoles were decreasing or deflating. But then when you put it back in the water, the wilted celery recovered as the cells that needed the water absorbed it, and their central vacuoles filled up and began to expand, and that caused the cells to go rigid, and that caused the celery to stand upright again. So that was a good example of turgor pressure and learning the difference between something wilting versus dying. So let's go back to our chart again and add a little bit more information here. Now we've learned that plant cells have, one, a cell wall, and they have a central vacuole, which is another organelle, just like the nucleus is an organelle. Well, the final kingdom in this module and in the sphere of biology is kingdom Animalia. This is the one that we're most familiar with, and so we're not going to spend a lot of time in this module discussing it. You've probably studied that in the past of all the different types of animals and things that there are out there. So here's an example with a picture of a whole bunch of those. But there's one that's kind of unique. This one's a little strange. We probably wouldn't normally look at this microscopic creature and call it an animal, but indeed it is. It's a microscopic animal. It has only one eye. It floats in the water. Some hunt smaller organisms to eat, and some are even parasitic. This is called a cyclops, and this particular picture is 100 times magnified. So this little guy is really, really tiny. That's the end of part 1 of this lecture. You can go on now to part 2.